The Shadow Watcher. Emily's nights were a battleground. Her bedroom a landscape of eerie shadows where sleep was both her refuge and her prison. A college student with a love for art history. Her days were colored with the vivid hues of Van Gogh and the stark contrasts of Picasso. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, her room dimmed to a palette of grays and blacks, setting the stage for her unwelcome visitor, the Shadow Watcher. It started subtly, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Emily would awaken in the dead of night, unable to move, her gaze fixed on the corner of the room where the darkness seemed deepest. The air felt thick, charged with a presence that was both unfamiliar and intimately known. A shadowy figure stood there, its form blurry, as if it were made of smoke and whispers. Initially, the figure was just a silhouette against the faint moonlight that seeped through the blinds. But with each passing night, it edged closer, its features becoming clearer, yet always indistinct. Emily's heart would race, her breaths becoming quick and shallow as she lay trapped in her own body. During the day, Emily's research into sleep paralysis unearthed ancient tales of nighttime watchers, beings that thrived in the borderlands of sleep. They were old legends, heavy with the dust of forgotten times, but they spoke of her shadow with chilling familiarity. It was said they could feed on fear, growing bolder and more tangible with each drop of dread. Nights were an orchestra of terror for Emily. The silence of her room was filled with the soft, sinister sound of something whispering her name, the voice a sibilant hiss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It knew things, deep, dark secrets and fears that Emily had never voiced, memories that she had locked away. "Why do you fear the dark, Emily?" it would ask, the words twisting in the air. She had read that sleep paralysis could bring hallucinations, both visual and auditory, but this felt different. This felt personal, a violation of her innermost self. It was as if the Shadow Watcher were sifting through her thoughts, plucking out the strands of her deepest anxieties to weave its own story. Each episode saw the Shadow Watcher draw nearer. At first, it loomed over her bed, its presence oppressive, a weight on her chest that made breathing a labored task. Then, it began to reach out, fingers elongating, stretching towards Emily as if to brush against her reality. It never touched her, but the intent was clear. It was closing the distance between them, shattering the invisible barrier that kept the night terrors at bay. Emily started to dread sleep, the fear of the encounter seeping into her waking hours. Her grades slipped, and her friends noticed the dark circles that had taken up permanent residence under her eyes. "Just nightmares," she would tell them, but the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. One night, in the depths of despair and exhaustion, Emily decided to confront it. She prepared herself, reading about lucid dreaming and methods to control her sleep paralysis. She would face the Shadow Watcher, challenge it, demand it to reveal its purpose. As the twilight turned to night, Emily lay in bed, her heart a steady drumbeat of apprehension and determination. The familiar paralysis crept over her, her limbs heavy, her body a leaden weight against the sheets. And then it was there, closer than ever before, its face inches from hers. But this time, Emily was ready. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice firm in her mind though she could not speak aloud. "What do you want from me?" The Shadow Watcher paused, its form wavering as if taken aback. And then it spoke, its voice a collage of every fear-laden whisper she had heard. "I am the one who watches," it said. "I am the shadow cast by your own light. I am here because you are afraid." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "My fear." "Yes," it hissed, "but not just any fear. I am born from the part of you that you refuse to face, the doubts and terrors you suppress. I am strong because you are scared to confront me." Realization dawned on Emily like a sunrise. This creature, this watcher, was a manifestation of her own fears, a personification of the anxieties that she had allowed to control her life. "No more," Emily thought with a clarity that cut through the fog of her dread. "I won't give you that power." She focused on the memories that gave her strength, the love of her family, the pride in her achievements, the joy she found in her passions. As she did, the Shadow Watcher began to recede, its form dissolving like mist at the break of day. "I'm not afraid of you," Emily said, her mental voice echoing with conviction. "You are nothing." With that, the shadow dissipated completely, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily moved. She sat up, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face not from fear, but from a profound sense of release. The following nights were different. The corner of her room remained just a corner. The whispers were gone, replaced by the gentle, comforting sounds of the night. Emily had faced her watcher and emerged victorious. And in her triumph, the nights became restful once more, the darkness a canvas for dreams, not nightmares. Emily knew now that shadows only exist where there is light. and with that knowledge, she reclaimed the night. The breathing room. In a small, sparsely furnished room where the walls bore the silent witness to a soldier's inner turmoil, Michael struggled with the war that followed him home. His nights were a relentless replay of distant battlefields, each sleep paralysis episode a tour back into the heart of darkness. War had left its indelible mark, but it was the unseen presence in his room, the heavy breathing of an entity unseen, that turned his safe haven into a theater of war each night. Michael, a war veteran, bore the scars of battle not only on his skin but in the depths of his psyche. His once sanctuary, the quiet room with its single window and worn-out dresser, had become the battleground for his most personal and daunting conflict. The episodes began without warning. A deep, labored breathing that seemed to rise from the very depths of the earth filled the room, turning the silence into a cacophony of remembered pain. It was as if the breaths were echoes of a comrade's last, a sound that Michael had heard all too often on the battlefield. Each night, as Michael lay paralyzed, his eyes would dart frantically, seeking the source of the sound. The breathing was close, so close he could almost feel the warmth of it on his neck, smell the faint odor of blood and sweat that had become all too familiar. The room seemed to shrink with each inhale and exhale, the walls closing in as the space filled with the oppressive weight of the past. Flashbacks marched through Michael's mind with the cadence of a relentless drum, each memory punctuated by the sound of breathing. The memories weren't just images, they were sensations, raw and unfiltered. The heat of the desert sun, the grit of sand against his skin, the weight of his rifle in his hands, and the heartbreak of loss, all accompanied by the rhythmic, suffocating breathing of the unseen entity. As the nights progressed, the entity's presence grew stronger, its breaths more suffocating, as if it were drawing life from Michael himself. The air in the room grew thick, charged with the energy of unspoken words and unsung dirges. Sleep was no reprieve, for the specter of his past loomed over him, enveloping him in a cloak of despair. One night, when the breathing had grown so loud it seemed to drown out the world, Michael resolved to make a final stand. In the grip of paralysis, his mind raced, searching for a weapon to vanquish his unseen tormentor. It was in this moment of desperation that clarity struck him like a flash of lightning in the midst of a storm. He realized the breathing was not just a manifestation of his trauma. It was a reminder of his guilt, the guilt of surviving when others did not. The breath was that of his fallen comrade, a young soldier who had looked up to Michael with unwavering trust and admiration. Michael's heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. He would no longer be a passive prisoner of his own mind. With a force of will that seemed to transcend the paralysis, he confronted the presence, not with anger, but with an outpouring of grief and acceptance. "I remember you," Michael whispered in his mind, his mental voice steady and clear. "I carry you with me, always. Your sacrifice is not forgotten. Rest now, my friend, for both of us." As if hearing his silent plea, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. The breathing, once a harbinger of dread, transformed into a soft sigh, a release of pent-up sorrow. The walls of the room seemed to recede, the darkness retreating to the corners where it belonged. The weight on Michael's chest lessened. The air became easier to draw into his lungs, and for the first time in what felt like eternity, he could move. He sat up, a single tear trailing down his cheek, not from fear but from liberation. The nights that followed were different. The breathing did not return. Instead, there was a new sound, a quiet, peaceful exhalation that seemed to whisper of hope and healing. Michael's room became his sanctuary once more, a place of solace rather than a stage for the ghosts of his past. Though the scars of war would always be a part of him, Michael had faced his inner demons, had stood his ground against the suffocating grip of his memories. He learned that the path to peace was not through forgetting, but through remembering and honoring those he had lost. The battle with his past was not over, perhaps it would never be. But Michael had reclaimed his space, his mind, and most importantly, his right to breathe freely in the quiet of his own room. The war within had been quieted, its presence acknowledged, and its power over him diminished. Michael had found his peace, one breath at a time. Eyes in the dark. Sarah had always found comfort in the darkness, a world where she lived since birth, where the absence of sight made her other senses sing. But in the chilling hours of the night, darkness became her foe, and her haven of a home turned into a stage for an unseen horror. When sleep paralysis gripped her, Sarah felt the piercing stare of countless eyes, eyes that whispered secrets of a world she'd never seen, eyes that held her captive in her bed with chains stronger than steel. This nightly terror was a stark contrast to the quiet sanctuary she knew by day. Each corner of her home, each creaking floorboard and whisper of wind, was familiar to her, but these whispering eyes were not. They began as a soft murmur, like leaves rustling in a distant wind. Sarah would awaken, her heart pounding against her ribs, as she felt the presence of something watching her. The whispers grew in volume, a cacophony of hisses that danced around her, brushing against her skin like moth wings. One night, amidst the eerie chorus of murmurs, she mustered the courage to respond. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that clenched her heart. The whispering ceased for a heartbeat, then resumed, this time with purpose. Words formed in the rustling, words that seemed to edge towards a warning. "Danger," they hissed, "danger is near." Each episode brought more fragments of the whispered messages, a puzzle that Sarah desperately tried to piece together. She was not merely hearing things. Her trusted instincts screamed that much. There was meaning in these whispers, a dire urgency that she could not ignore. The revelation struck one evening when the whispers grew frantic. "Behind you," they urged, a breath against her neck, sending shivers down her spine. Sarah's pulse quickened, and although she could not see, she sensed the presence of a real and tangible threat lurking in her own home. Days became a quest for answers. Sarah ran her hands along the walls, feeling for anomalies, listening for the subtleties that escaped most. It was during one of these explorations that she found it, a door cleverly concealed within the contours of the hallway. With trembling hands, she felt the cold surface of the door, her fingers tracing the outline of a lock. Her house, a place she thought she knew intimately, had kept a secret from her. The whispering eyes in her paralysis had been a guide, leading her to this hidden portal. Her heart raced as she contemplated the implications. What was this door? Who had installed it? And what lay beyond? Sarah's mind raced with possibilities, each more frightening than the last. With a deep breath, she unlocked the door, the click of the mechanism echoing ominously in the silence of the house. A musty smell wafted through the gap, and a chill air caressed her face. Sarah stepped inside, her hands outstretched, her cane tapping ahead of her. The room was small, the air stale, and the floor was littered with objects that crunched underfoot. As she moved, her hands encountered a table, upon which lay objects that felt unnervingly like tools. A shiver ran through her as she touched something metallic and sharp, a knife. Sarah's mind reeled. The danger the whispering eyes had warned her about was all too real. Someone had been coming into her home, using this room as a hideaway. The thought that she had been sleeping just meters away from this place night after night filled her with a visceral dread. In the darkness of the hidden room, Sarah realized the truth of her situation. The eyes that watched her in her paralysis had been protectors, not tormentors. The true terror lay not in the ghostly visions of her condition but in the reality that had been concealed within her own walls. She called the police, her voice steady but filled with the gravity of her discovery. When they arrived, she explained everything. The sleep paralysis, the whispering eyes, the secret room. The officers were skeptical until they saw the evidence for themselves. The subsequent investigation revealed that an intruder had indeed been entering her home, using the secret room as a surveillance point. The whispers Sarah had heard were not hallucinations, but the soft sounds of the intruder moving through the house, his breathing masked by her paralysis episodes. Sarah's ordeal had uncovered a truth that resonated deep within her. That seeing is not always believing, and that sometimes the eyes that cannot see are the ones that perceive the truth most clearly. In the aftermath, Sarah's home was cleansed of the intruder's presence, and she felt a renewed sense of peace. The whispering eyes never returned in her episodes of sleep paralysis, their warning mission fulfilled. But Sarah would never forget the feeling of being watched by eyes in the dark, eyes that had seen the danger she could not and had stood as vigilant guardians over her vulnerable sleep. Her experience with the whispering eyes had taught her a profound lesson about the nature of perception. Sight was not the only path to understanding the world, and blindness was not a lack but simply a different way of seeing. Sarah's nights were quiet once again, but she would always remember the time when darkness spoke to her, when eyes that were not eyes had been her guiding light through the perilous shadows of the unknown. The crushing weight. Jonah's relationship with his own reflection was like a silent war. Mirrors were the enemy, and the numbers on the scale were the battle score he never seemed to win. The outside world's view of him only added to the heaviness that seemed to press down on his chest with every breath. This feeling of being crushed, however, became terrifyingly real at night. In the clutches of sleep paralysis, an invisible oppressor perched on his chest, turning his shallow breaths into a suffocating struggle. It was not just a physical sensation, it was as if the force was feeding on his deepest insecurities, each one adding to its weight. Jonah's world was an everyday battlefield. The snickers from strangers, the backhanded compliments from acquaintances, and the ever-judging eyes that followed him seemed to find a home in his bedroom's shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon each night, his anxiety would rise, anticipating the coming ordeal. One night, as the familiar pressure settled on his chest, Jonah tried a different tactic. Instead of fighting the weight, he spoke to it, his voice a mere whisper. "Why are you doing this to me?" There was no verbal response, only a sensation of understanding that washed over him. It was as though the force was an old friend, one who knew all his secrets, his failures, and his fears. Night after night, Jonah faced the oppressive force, and day by day, he began to confront the source of his suffering. He started with small steps, a glance in the mirror paired with a positive affirmation, a healthy meal, a short walk outside. He stopped averting his eyes from his own reflection, slowly acknowledging his worth beyond his physical form. As Jonah worked on his self-acceptance, the night visits changed. The weight lessened with each passing dream, becoming a manageable pressure, like a gentle reminder rather than a suffocating force. He came to a startling realization one dawn after a particularly intense episode. The oppressive force was him, or rather, a twisted mirror image of his deepest self-loathing. It was not an external enemy but an embodiment of the societal pressure and personal shame he had internalized over the years. This twist in his understanding transformed his nights. Instead of dreading sleep, he prepared for it by reflecting on positive moments from his day, by journaling his thoughts, by showing gratitude for his body's abilities rather than resenting its shape. One evening, as Jonah braced himself for the inevitable visitation, he found that the weight didn't come. He waited, breath held, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Instead, there was a profound silence and a feeling of lightness that he had not felt in years. Days turned to weeks, and the oppressive force that once pinned him down did not return. Jonah's journey towards self-love had exorcised the demon that was his own creation. He realized that the crushing weight had been a manifestation of his inner turmoil, a physical representation of the emotional baggage he had carried for so long. As Jonah's self-esteem grew, so did his social circle. People began to notice the change in him, the newfound confidence that seemed to light him from within. Jonah found strength in his vulnerability, sharing his story with others who struggled with the same demon. He became an advocate for body positivity, a voice in the darkness for those still fighting their silent wars. Jonah learned that the most daunting weights we carry are often those we place upon ourselves, and that letting go of self-judgment can free us in ways we never imagined. The story of Jonah and the crushing weight became a tale of victory, not over a spectral force, but over the shadows of doubt that can haunt anyone. It was a message that rang clear. The only way to lift the weight was to rise above it, to forgive oneself, and to step into the light of self-acceptance. In the end, Jonah realized that every night of struggle had been a step towards liberation. The entity, the mirror image of his darkest feelings, faded into memory as Jonah's life filled with purpose and self-love. He had conquered the crushing weight, not by force, but through the transformative power of self-compassion and the understanding that we are all more than the sum of our parts. And as he shared his story with the world, he knew that the weight he once feared now had no power over him. It was a chapter closed, a battle won, and a life reclaimed. The darkness no longer held whispers of self-doubt, but rather the quiet assurance of a man who had faced his deepest fears and emerged victorious. The Old Hag's Curse. In the dim light of the moon, Linda's bedroom was a canvas for the play of shadows that seemed to whisper of ancient times and dark secrets. She was a single mother, strong and resilient, yet at night, her strength was sapped by an unseen force, a nightmarish entity that folklore named the Old Hag. The hag would come as the clock tolled for midnight, a ghastly figure perched upon Linda's chest, her weight oppressive, her whispers a venomous threat of archaic curses. Those whispers twisted in the dark, ensnaring Linda in a terrifying state between sleep and wakefulness where she could neither move nor scream. Each morning, Linda rose, pale and drawn, the hag's hexes clinging to her like cobwebs. It was not just the exhaustion that weighed on her, but a gnawing sense of dread that what visited her in the night was more than just a figment of her imagination. In her waking hours, Linda scoured old family records and dusty tomes from the local library. The curse, it seemed, was a thread woven through the tapestry of her family's history, a malevolent inheritance that latched onto the women in her lineage, feeding on their vigor. The whispers of the old hag spoke of sins long past, of a malevolent ancestor whose own misdeeds had damned her descendants. This revelation chilled Linda to her core, but it also stoked the fires of her resolve. She was determined to break the cycle, to free herself and her child from the curse's grasp. As Linda delved deeper into the mystery, strange occurrences began to plague her home. Objects would move of their own volition, shadows seemed to leer from corners, and the air grew thick with the scent of bygone days, a mix of earth and something far more sinister. In her research, Linda uncovered a potential way to break the curse, a ritual that required a confrontation with the hag herself. It demanded bravery and an unwavering will, for to falter was to fall prey to the hag's eternal enmity. The night of the ritual, Linda prepared herself, gathering items of personal significance that would tether her to the present, photographs of her child, a locket from her mother, and a sprig of lavender for protection. As the clock struck 12, the air grew frigid, and the shadows in the room coiled like serpents at the foot of her bed. The old hag materialized, her form more grotesque than ever, her eyes burning coals in the darkness. Linda remained steadfast, reciting the words of the ritual, her voice steady even as the hag loomed closer, her decrepit hands reaching with claw-like fingers. "You are not welcome here," Linda declared, her voice echoing with the power of her conviction. "Your time has passed. I sever the ties that bind us." A howl filled the room, a sound of rage and sorrow so intense that the very walls seemed to tremble. The hag's form wavered, becoming translucent, her curses dissipating into the night. With a final burst of ethereal light, the hag vanished, leaving Linda gasping for air, her chest finally free from the weight of centuries. The air cleared, and a profound silence enveloped the house, a silence that spoke of battles fought and won. In the aftermath, Linda's home was cleansed of the otherworldly chill that had once pervaded it. Her nights were no longer haunted by the presence of the old hag. She and her child could live without the looming specter of familial curses binding their fate. Yet, the fight to break free from the old hag's curse had taken its toll. Linda found herself stronger, yet more introspective, aware now of the delicate fabric that constituted her family's legacy. She had glimpsed the darkness that threaded through it and had emerged victorious. But the experience left her with an indelible mark. The tale of the old hag's curse became a cautionary story, one that Linda shared with her child as they grew, a reminder of the power that the past held and the strength required to defy it. As her child listened, wide-eyed and curious, Linda instilled in them the lesson that the truest form of courage was in facing one's demons, in acknowledging them, and in asserting one's right to be free from the shadows of bygone eras. Linda's story was one of terror faced and overcome, of a legacy redefined not by the whispers of curses, but by the unyielding strength of a mother's love and the unbreakable bond of family that no curse could ever hope to sever. The old hag was but a memory now, a defeated specter of a bygone curse, powerless against the light of a new day and the resolve of those who refuse to be bound by the chains of the past. The unseen child. David's home was a shrine to silence, a monument to the life he once dreamed of with a family. But the cruel hands of fate had left him a childless widower, with only the echoes of a future that would never come to keep him company. It was in the clutches of sleep, in the fragile realm between consciousness and the dark abyss of night, that he felt the presence of a child, laughing and crying in turns, an invisible specter tied to the very core of his longing. As the days passed, the phantom of the unseen child grew bolder. Its laughter once held a comforting note, a balm to the jagged edges of David's soul. But comfort twisted into dread when the giggles morphed into sobs and sinister whispers in the dead of night. The air in David's house grew thick with the scent of nostalgia, each corner steeped in a melancholic yearning for what might have been. A crayon here, a small handprint upon a fogged window there, subtle intrusions that eroded the barrier between the past and present. One day, a discovery sent shivers down David's spine. A hidden door within the walls of his home, cleverly concealed behind the lining of the wallpaper that had begun to peel. With trembling hands, David pried open the doorway to reveal a room untouched by time, a child's sanctuary long forgotten. Toys lay scattered on the floor. A small bed sat adorned with dusty sheets, and drawings of a family, happy and whole, adorned the walls. It was a capsule of innocence lost, a testament to a child that once filled these walls with laughter and tears. As David stood in the threshold of the secret chamber, the air shifted, the temperature plummeted, and the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes grew unbearable. It was then that the true nature of his haunting became clear. The child, whether a ghost of the past or a manifestation of his own grief, was trapped in an eternal search for the family it never had. Nights became a battleground, where the sounds of the child shifted from the corners of his room to the foot of his bed, and where the comforting touches turned cold and clammy like the hands of the dead. David's paralysis left him at the mercy of the unseen child, whose presence was now more menacing than ever, its cries a cacophony that pierced the veil of night. Desperation led David to seek help, to find a way to free both himself and the child's spirit from the chains that bound them to this sorrowful house. Through research and whispered tales, he learned of rituals and words of release, of the power of acknowledgement and the importance of letting go. He filled the hidden room with light and warmth, replacing the dust and shadows with tokens of peace. David read bedtime stories aloud, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, as he addressed the unseen child with a gentle acknowledgement of its existence and its pain. As the ritual reached its crescendo, David's voice filled with conviction, a clear and heartfelt goodbye to the child who had never been his, yet whom he had come to love in a way he never expected. "You are not forgotten, little one," he said, "but you must find your peace, as must I." That night, David slept without the weight of presence in his room. The child's laughter and cries faded into a poignant silence that spoke of final farewells and journeys continued on the other side of the veil. In the days that followed, the home felt lighter, as if a heavy shroud had been lifted from its very foundation. David began to heal, the memories of his own loss intertwining with the liberation of the child's spirit, leading him toward a future where the past no longer held dominion over his heart. The story of the unseen child became a murmur within the walls, a gentle reminder of the ephemeral nature of life and the enduring power of love. David learned that in facing our hauntings and confronting the apparitions of our deepest yearnings, we could find release not only for the spirits that linger but for ourselves as we walk the path toward acceptance and peace. And so, the house that once echoed with the sorrow of the unseen became a sanctuary for hope, a place where the whispers of the past were acknowledged with a respectful nod before turning towards the promise of a new dawn. David's story was one of grief and love, of terror confronted, and of a peace hard-earned, a tale as timeless as the spirits that dance on the edge of our reality, in the quiet hours between one life and the next. The whispering walls. In the stillness of the night, the walls of Anita's old house seemed to come alive with secretive murmurs. Anita, an audio technician by day, found her expertise in sound had become a curse at night. As she drifted into the vulnerable state of sleep, the whispers began to seep into her ears, indecipherable and soft, like the rustling of leaves in a wind she couldn't feel. At first, Anita thought it was just the product of her exhausted mind, a side effect of the sleep paralysis that left her trapped in a wakeful nightmare. But as the episodes increased, the whispers grew clearer, threading through the layers of her subconscious, urging her to listen, to understand. Curiosity morphed into obsession as Anita began to record the nocturnal sounds. She spent hours with headphones pressed to her ears, teasing apart the consonants and vowels of the spectral voices. The messages were fragmented, but a chilling narrative began to emerge, one that spoke of hidden truths and buried lies. The voices painted a picture of a grim past, a history recorded in the very bones of the house. Anita learned of a family, of laughter and love that had once echoed through the halls. But beneath that, there was darkness, a creeping shadow of malice that whispered of a tragedy. Anita's search led her to the local archives, where she scoured old newspapers and records, her eyes flitting over the faded print, looking for any clue that could help her decipher the whispers. And there, between the lines of a decades-old police report, she found mention of her home, a family annihilated, a case left cold, a story unfinished. The whispers grew insistent, weaving themselves into a cacophony that filled Anita's paralysis with dread. They spoke of betrayal and revenge, of a darkness that refused to dissipate with the morning light. Each night, the voices seemed to come from closer within the walls, as though whatever recited there was drawing nearer to the realm of the living. Anita knew she shouldn't listen, that some secrets were meant to stay buried within the plaster and wood. But the whispers wouldn't let her be. They followed her through the day, a haunting melody that only she could hear. Finally, she could take it no more. Anita resolved to uncover the truth, to give voice to the silent story that clung to her home. She peeled back the wallpaper, chipped away at the paint, her tools uncovering a hidden compartment within the walls. There, amidst the cobwebs and dust, lay a small box, its wood rotted with age. With trembling hands, Anita opened the box. Inside, she found relics of a life-long past, a locket containing a curl of golden hair, a small, tarnished toy soldier, and letters penned in a desperate scrawl, their words speaking of a forbidden love and a looming threat. The whispers crescendoed, a triumphant chorus as Anita read the letters. They were not just remnants of the past. They were a confession, an apology from beyond the grave. The house had been a witness to a tale of love that had spiraled into madness, ending in a night of blood and regret. That night, the whispers changed. They were no longer indecipherable murmurs, but clear, pained voices that called out in the darkness. Anita lay paralyzed, her eyes wide with horror as the walls seemed to close in around her. The whispers were not just echoes. They were the voices of the lost, seeking solace, seeking release. In the thrall of her paralysis, Anita saw them, the spectral figures of the family that once lived in her home. They were not sinister but sorrowful, trapped within the walls that had witnessed their demise. They reached out to her, their whispers now pleas for recognition, for peace. As dawn broke, Anita knew what she had to do. The story of the family had to be told, their spirits set free from the tragedy that bound them. With the evidence from the walls and the letters as her guide, she brought the story to light, speaking for those who no longer could. The whispers faded over time, the walls silent once more. But Anita would never forget the voices that had compelled her to uncover the truth. Her house was quiet now, but the whispers had left their mark, etching a story of loss and redemption into the fabric of her life. In the search for truth, Anita had found more than she'd bargained for. She had become the vessel for the whispers, the keeper of the house's dark history. But in giving voice to the silence, she had found her own peace. And in the stillness that followed, she understood that some walls don't just hold up a home, they guard its stories, whispering them to those who dare to listen. The Imprisoner. Neil's once pristine bedroom had become a courtroom of condemnation, its walls whispering judgments in the dead of night. As a lawyer, Neil had built his reputation on victories, not truths, a choice that now haunted his dreams and waking moments with equal ferocity. His sleep paralysis, a merciless captor, shackled him to the bed as spectral figures of a judge and jury emerged through the walls, their forms blurred but their intent as clear as the guilt that weighed on his conscience. These phantoms were the embodiment of Neil's darkest fears, a judge with eyes that burn with the fires of justice unserved, and a jury of the innocents, their lives derailed by his legal machinations. Their ghostly visitations began as soon as the light dipped below the horizon, transforming the silence of his room into a cacophony of whispered accusations and the heavy breath of anticipated verdicts. Each night, the ethereal court called Neil to account for his sins. The air grew thick, almost unbreathable, as the cases he had manipulated played out before him, visions of those he had wrongfully imprisoned clashing against the walls like raging waves. The spectral judge, a ghastly gavel in hand, would ask him to defend his actions, his voice a hollow echo that left a chill skittering across Neil's immobile form. The room, a chamber that once promised rest, now felt like a prison, the darkness a cell that held the stench of his moral decay. The trials were excruciating. Each testimony from the ghostly figures brought a suffocating sense of dread that pressed upon him like a physical weight. One night, a pivotal moment arrived. The spectral jury's eyes, usually cold and accusing, held a glimmer of something different, mercy, perhaps, or the possibility of redemption. The judge's voice resonated with a gravity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Neil," he intoned, "you have one chance to alter your sentence. Admit your guilt, seek forgiveness, and make amends. Only then can the scales of justice be balanced." Neil's mind screamed for him to respond, to confess to the years of twisting the law for his gain. But his voice was a prisoner to the paralysis, as unreachable as the fading hope of absolution. Morning light would scatter the apparitions, but their words lingered, a relentless echo throughout his day. The once confident lawyer now spent his hours poring over case files of those he had wronged, the letters and faces of the condemned and their families blurring through his tears. He realized he had been living in a prison of his own making, the bars forged from lies and deceptions. Neil began to right his wrongs, working to overturn the convictions he had secured through dubious means. With each case reopened, with every step toward justice, the nighttime visitations grew less torturous, the spectral judge's gaze less fiery. But the road to redemption was a gauntlet, each step haunted by the shadows of his past. Neil's resolve was tested time and again, but the prospect of freeing himself from the spectral court's condemnation drove him forward. His efforts began to bear fruit. The innocent were released, their sentences overturned, and families reunited. Yet the true trial, Neil discovered, was not fought in the courtroom but within the confines of his own soul. The spectral jury's presence became less menacing, their forms fading with each act of contrition Neil made. The judge's gavel sounded less often, and when it did, it was a reminder not of the man Neil had been, but of the man he was striving to become. The final visitation came unexpectedly. Neil lay in bed, the paralysis gripping him with familiar coldness. The judge's form loomed above him, a once terrifying figure now appearing almost noble. "Neil," the spectral judge spoke, his voice no longer a chilling whisper, but clear and authoritative. "You have faced the court of conscience and emerged with a desire for atonement. The path of redemption is lifelong, but you have taken the first steps." With those words, the judge and jury receded into the walls for the last time, their departure a silent acknowledgement of Neil's penance. The room brightened, a weight lifted, and for the first time in years, Neil's breath came easily, the air free of the taint of guilt. The lawyer who once imprisoned the innocent had himself been imprisoned by the chains of his actions. But as the dawn of a new day broke, so too did the hold of the spectral court. Neil's journey toward redemption would continue, each day a chance to balance the scales he had once so carelessly tipped. As the sun rose, casting light on the walls that had witnessed his nightly trials, Neil felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The whispers were gone, replaced by a resolute silence that spoke of second chances and the enduring hope that even those who imprison can find the key to their own liberation. The Body Snatcher, Clara's hands, usually so steady as they shaped the formless clay into magnificent sculptures, now trembled with an unspoken dread. Each night, as the world slipped into slumber, she lay in bed, eyes wide with fear, paralyzed and waiting for the twilight visitor that had chosen her as its eerie muse. In her studio apartment, adorned with sculptures that mirrored the human condition, an unwelcome entity had begun to haunt her nights. It was a specter that defied the laws of nature, a shadow that sought to become substance by stealing the very features from Clara's face, a detail at a time. The first night it appeared, it was nothing but a vague silhouette at the edge of her vision, an outline devoid of features. But as the nights progressed, each visit brought a new horror, eyes that slowly gained the same hazel tint as hers, lips that curved into an all-too-familiar smile, cheekbones that echoed her own. The entity, silent as the grave, was transforming into Clara's doppelganger. By day, the echoes of these nighttime horrors bled into her reality. Her art, once praised for its vitality, now took on a sinister edge. The sculptures' faces began to twist, their expressions morphing into silent screams and contorted grins that mirrored the fear etched into Clara's heart. Friends recoiled, disturbed by the unsettling shift in her work, and whispers of madness swirled around her. Clara's struggle was not just against the entity but against the unraveling of her own identity. She watched, powerless, as the specter co-opted her visage, her essence being siphoned away night after night. Even in the daylight, she felt the presence of the entity, a ghostly twin just out of sight, a whisper of movement in her peripheral vision. The distinction between herself and the doppelganger began to blur. Mirrors became a battleground, Clara locking eyes with her own reflection, questioning its truth. Was the figure that stared back at her the entity wearing her face, or was it truly herself? Her once peaceful dreamscape became a labyrinth of existential dread. Each corner turned, revealing the entity in her form, mimicking her movements but always with a sinister twist. Her sculptures, now grotesque parodies of her plight, seemed to mock her with their clay-cold stares, as if they too were part of the entity's macabre game. Desperation led Clara to seek out old tomes and mystics, any source that might hold the key to banishing the creature that threatened to erase her from existence. She tried rituals and charms, but the entity was undeterred, its imitation of her growing more precise with each passing night. As the entity encroached on her waking world, Clara's isolation deepened. People around her began to notice the slight oddities in her behavior, the moments where her movements seemed out of sync, her laughter a beat too late, as if something else was learning how to be her. Clara's art became her final solace and her ultimate plan of attack. She would create a sculpture, a trap imbued with all her pain and fear, a vessel for the entity. Night after night, she worked, pouring her soul into the clay, shaping it into her own image, a perfect replica. The night of completion, the entity arrived once more, its features now indistinguishable from Clara's. Paralyzed, she watched as it approached the sculpture. A silent exchange passed between them, a recognition of the challenge laid out. The entity reached out, touching the clay face, and as it did, Clara put every ounce of will into her silent command, "Leave me and become the clay." It was as if the studio held its breath, the shadows pooling around the sculpture. Then, slowly, the entity pressed itself into the artwork, the features of the clay shifting, taking on the depth of life as Clara's began to flatten, become smooth again. The entity was caught, its stolen features now part of the sculpture, leaving Clara's face hers alone once more. The following days were quiet, the previous vitality returning to Clara's art, her sculptures once again praised for their beauty and not their horror. The doppelganger sculpture was locked away, a reminder of the entity that could have been her undoing. Yet, in the silent hours between dusk and dawn, Clara sometimes wondered if she had truly won. She would run her fingers over her own features, searching for any sign of the entity's touch. Her friends celebrated her return to normalcy, but in the solitude of her studio, surrounded by faces born of her imagination, Clara could never shake the feeling of being watched, the sense of another presence lurking just behind her reflection. The entity, now a part of her art, was a silent sentinel, a testament to the thin veil between self and shadow, a haunting memento of the Body Snatcher that almost claimed her life for its own. The Breach. In the heart of a clandestine laboratory, Dr. Simon Merrill, a scientist devoted to the study of dream states, initiated an experiment that would blur the lines between nightmare and reality. His objective was simple yet audacious: to map the neural pathways of the sleeping mind, to decode the language of dreams. Little did he know that his quest for knowledge would unlock more than just the secrets of the subconscious. The lab, a symphony of humming machines and blinking lights, became Simon's sanctuary, the place where he tirelessly recorded the enigmatic patterns of slumber. But as the nights grew longer and the data more perplexing, Simon found himself standing at the threshold of an uncanny discovery. One fateful evening, as electrodes snaked across his scalp and monitors displayed the dance of his dreaming brain, Simon experienced a sleep paralysis like no other. Immobilized, he became acutely aware of a presence in the room, a silhouette shrouded in the indistinct boundaries between shadow and substance. It spoke in a voice that seemed to reverberate from within and all around, its words an enigmatic melody of science and suggestion. "I am the harbinger from the fold between worlds," the figure declared, its voice distorted as if filtered through a cosmic prism. "Your search has called to me across the vastness of the multiverse." Simon, equal parts terrified and fascinated, listened as the being began to impart knowledge of celestial mechanics and quantum realms, insights far beyond human science. The entity seemed benevolent, a visitor offering gifts of wisdom, yet with each revelation, the air in the lab grew colder, the shadows deeper. As days passed, Simon's research leapt forward. The entity's revelations allowed him to shatter the established dogmas of physics and dream analysis. Yet, this pursuit of knowledge was not without cost. His colleagues began to question his sudden breakthroughs. His behavior grew erratic, and the world within the lab became his entire reality. But the more Simon interacted with the being, the more he began to sense its true intentions. The knowledge it shared served a darker purpose. It spoke of the breach, a rift it sought to widen, a gateway from its dimension to Simon's own. "I seek passage," the entity whispered one chilling night, its form clearer now, more defined, as if it was drawing substance from Simon's world. "Through you, the breach will open. Through your dreams, I will enter." Panic gripped Simon as he realized he was but a pawn in a game that spanned dimensions. The experiment had to end. He dismantled his equipment, destroyed his research, but the presence remained, a specter in the lab, an echo in his mind. Sleep became a battleground, his dreams the territory the entity sought to claim. Simon's nights were filled with visions of the breach, a swirling vortex that promised wonder but teemed with malevolence. He saw other worlds, bizarre and twisted, landscapes where the laws of nature were mere suggestions and where the entity reigned unchallenged. With each encounter, the being's voice grew more insistent, its form more menacing. Simon could feel the fabric of his reality fraying at the edges, the separation between dimensions growing perilously thin. He was a man possessed, haunted by a knowledge he could not unlearn, a curiosity that had ignited this perilous connection. The entity's attempts to cross over became more aggressive, the paralysis sessions longer, the being's hold on Simon's world stronger. The lab, once a place of scientific sanctity, now thrummed with an otherworldly energy. Simon watched, helpless, as his instruments flickered with inexplicable readings, a sign that the breach was close to opening. In a final, desperate act, Simon resolved to confront the being within the dreamscape. He induced sleep paralysis, and as the entity materialized, he focused all his willpower on closing the breach. The lab shook with the force of colliding dimensions, lights bursting, glass shattering, as the two realities resisted the merging. The being let out a distorted scream, a cacophony of frustration and rage, as it clung to the edges of the breach. Simon, with every ounce of his being, pushed back against the darkness, his mind a lance of pure intention. Then, silence. Simon awoke to a lab in ruins, the morning light piercing through broken windows. The entity was gone, the breach was sealed. He had prevented a catastrophe, but at what cost? His reputation was in shambles. His colleagues viewed him with suspicion, and the scientific community questioned his sanity. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, when the world blurs and consciousness wanes, Simon still hears the faint, distorted whispers of the entity. A chilling reminder that knowledge is a double-edged sword and that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. The breach remains, a hairline fracture between worlds, a silent testament to the scientist's ordeal, a haunting echo of the dangers that lurk when humanity dares to tamper with the unknown.